At first, the keepers thought the mother was protecting her newborn. She stood over him, one huge hand resting near his tiny body, her dark eyes scanning the enclosure the way gorilla mothers sometimes do in those first raw hours after birth. Alert, unsettled, still processing everything that had just changed. The baby was tucked beneath her, barely visible, just a small dark shape in the grass, motionless except for the thin shallow rise and fall of his chest. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. There's a rule in great ape care that every keeper learns early and never forgets. You give the mother space, you trust the instinct, you watch from a distance, and you wait. Interfering too soon can shatter something that can never be rebuilt. So the team stayed behind the glass, and they watched, and for a little while, everything looked like it might be fine. Then the newborn moved. It was barely anything, a slight shift of one arm, the kind of tiny involuntary gesture that newborn primates make before they have any real control of their bodies. Just a tremor of new life trying to find its place in the world. Nala reacted before anyone could process what was happening. She pivoted sharply, not aggressive, not deliberate, just disoriented the way a large animal moves when it doesn't know where to put itself. Her right foot came down 6 inches from the baby's chest. The floor shook from the impact. One of the keepers behind the glass made a sound that wasn't quite a word. That wasn't protection anymore. That was something else entirely. Nala was a first-time mother. She had arrived at the sanctuary 2 years earlier, settled well, caused no problems. Nobody had been worried about her. The pregnancy was clean. The birth, from what the overnight team could piece together from the monitor footage, had been fast. Maybe too fast. The kind of birth that doesn't give an animal time to prepare before it's already over. And now she was standing over a newborn she clearly didn't know what to do with. She would lower her head and look at him, then look away, then shift her weight without going anywhere, then circle and look again. She kept touching him with the backs of her fingers, not a cradling motion, nothing that looked like holding, more like an uncertain tap toward something she wasn't sure about. Every time the baby made a sound, Nala flinched. Every time he moved, she repositioned, and every repositioning brought her massive body into dangerous proximity to his impossibly small one. She wasn't hurting him on purpose. Anyone watching closely could see that. She simply had no idea what she was doing. Daniel, the senior keeper on shift, stood at the observation window with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long time. 11 years working with great apes. He knew what deliberate aggression looked like in a gorilla mother. He knew what rejection looked like. He knew what fear looked like. This wasn't any of those things. This was confusion, pure and simple and dangerous. The confusion of a 300-pound animal who had just gone through a fast, disorienting birth and was now sharing her enclosure with a creature she didn't fully understand. A creature that happened to be hers. She wanted to be close to him. That much was obvious. Every time she drifted away, she came back within 30 seconds. She couldn't leave him, but she couldn't figure out what closeness was supposed to look like either. So she hovered, she shifted, and her feet kept landing in places that made everyone behind that glass go completely still. Daniel called the veterinary team at 6:47 in the morning. He kept his voice low. The protocol was clear. Watch, assess, do not intervene unless the infant is in immediate physical danger. A rushed intervention with a stressed gorilla mother could end far worse than a mother who was simply being clumsy. Separating them at the wrong moment, in the wrong way, could break something that would never fully heal. But Daniel had been watching for 40 minutes, and the baby had barely moved in the last 10. That was what worried him most. Not the near misses, not the heavy, uncertain footsteps. What worried him was the stillness of that tiny body in the grass. Newborn gorillas are supposed to be noisy, demanding. They cry, they grip, they root instinctively toward warmth. This one had gone quiet. Daniel zoomed the monitor camera in as far as it would go. The baby's chest was still moving, but just barely. Then Nala turned again, wide, unsteady. Her right foot lifted and came down on the edge of a towel near the birth site, shifting the fabric, shifting the baby, rolling him 2 inches to the left. And the baby made a sound, high and thin and desperate, the kind of sound that cuts straight through glass and lands somewhere deep in your chest. Nala froze. Her head dropped. Her hand began to lower toward the baby's back. Daniel turned from the monitor. He looked at the vet tech standing behind him, and he said the 4 words nobody in that room had wanted to hear. We have to go in. The team did not run. That was the first thing anyone watching from outside might have found surprising. A newborn gorilla lying motionless in an enclosure with a disoriented 300-pound mother, and the humans responding to it walked, moved with the kind of controlled urgency that only comes from knowing exactly what panic costs in a room like that one. Daniel led. 2 keepers flanked him, Rosa, the veterinary technician, carried a soft thermal blanket folded under one arm and kept her breathing steady. 6 years on site, 3 previous great ape interventions. She knew what this moment asked of her, and she gave it. Nobody spoke above a murmur. The communication between them was glances, small nods, the compressed shorthand of a team that had rehearsed this enough times to do it without thinking. The plan was not to go directly to the baby. The plan was to move Nala first. Sanctuaries that work with gorillas use what are called shift corridors, connected passages that let keepers guide animals from one space to another without direct confrontation. Done correctly, it doesn't feel like a chase. It feels like routine, a familiar voice, a food door opening, the small reliable signals that say, "This is normal, come this way." The problem was that nothing about this morning was normal for Nala. She heard Daniel's voice and turned toward it. Good sign. She recognized him. Her posture didn't harden into aggression, but then she looked back at the baby, and she didn't move. She looked at Daniel, then at the baby, then at Daniel again. There was something almost unbearable about watching that happen, the pull in 2 directions she couldn't name. She made a low sound in her throat, uncertain rather than threatening, and shifted her weight without going anywhere. Daniel kept his voice completely even, same tone he used every morning during feeding, calm, familiar, unremarkable. He held fruit where she could see it through the corridor grate. He did not look at the baby. He did not look at the other keepers. Every signal in his body was pointed at her, and only her, as if the only thing happening in the world right now was a man offering a gorilla her breakfast. 4 minutes passed. 4 minutes of Nala swaying, hesitating, glancing back at the small still shape in the grass. Then her feet began to carry her toward the corridor. Rosa moved the moment Nala's back was turned. She crossed the enclosure floor in 12 steps, dropped to one knee, and pressed 2 fingers gently to the side of the baby's neck. The thermal blanket was already open in her other hand. She worked without rushing, without flinching, the way you work when you understand that panic is not something you can afford right now. The baby was cold. Not the normal cool of a newborn that hasn't been dried and warmed yet, cold in a way that made Rosa's jaw tighten. His skin had taken on a grayish tone at the extremities. His breathing was shallow and irregular, with pauses in it that lasted a beat too long. She wrapped him quickly, lifted him with both hands in a motion so smooth it barely disturbed the grass beneath him. He weighed almost nothing. She was already moving toward the door when Nala realized what had happened. Something shifted. A sound, a change in the air, some signal Rosa's exit sent across the enclosure. Nala turned back from the corridor. She saw the empty patch of flattened grass. Her head came up. Her body stiffened. She pressed forward against the barrier. Not charging, not screaming, just pressing, the full weight of her against the grate, both hands wrapped around the bars, eyes moving in rapid searching sweeps across the enclosure. Daniel stayed exactly where he was and kept talking to her, low and steady. He did not acknowledge what had just happened behind her. He did not move toward the door. He kept his voice as level as the floor beneath her feet, even though Rosa's footsteps receding down the corridor toward the care room were the loudest thing he had ever heard. Nala made a sound he had never heard from her before. Not aggression, not bluster. Something lower and more private than that. Something that came from a place in her chest that had just discovered it was empty. She pressed her forehead against the bars and went still. Daniel exhaled slowly. The first part was done. Whether it had been fast enough he was about to find out. Rosa set the baby on the warming surface. Dr. Mbeki was already beside her. Oxygen line ready. Warming lamp on. They worked in near silence. No dramatic chaos. Just steady hands, quiet voices, and a tiny life suspended somewhere between the morning it had started and whatever came next. Warmth first. Always warmth first. The baby lay without moving. His chest rose and fell. Rose and fell. Then a pause that stretched one beat longer than it should. Rosa looked at Dr. Mbeki. Dr. Mbeki kept his eyes on the baby's chest and did not look away. Daniel's voice came through the radio on the counter. Quiet and careful. Is he breathing? Nobody answered the radio right away. Not because they were ignoring Daniel. Because in that room at that moment, every person's attention had narrowed to a single point. The baby's chest. The rise. The fall. The pause between them that kept stretching just a little longer than anyone could comfortably hold. Dr. Mbeki placed 2 fingers lightly against the infant's sternum. Then the chest moved again. 3, shallow, uneven. But there. Dr. Mbeki pressed the radio button without looking up. He's breathing. We're working. That was all. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then went back to work. The next 30 minutes moved the way good emergency medicine always moves, not dramatically, not with sudden reversals, just steadily, methodically, one small stabilization at a time. The warming lamp brought his temperature up in slow increments. The grayish tone at his fingers and ears began to fade as circulation found its rhythm. His breathing evened out, not strong yet, not the full demanding breath of a healthy newborn, but regular enough that the pauses stopped stealing the air from the room. He still hadn't made a sound. That was the thing keeping Rosa's shoulders tight even as the numbers improved. Newborn great apes are loud. They cry when they're cold, when they're hungry, when they're disoriented, which in those first hours means almost constantly. The silence from this one felt like a body that had spent everything it had just on the work of surviving, with nothing left over for anything else. Dr. Mbeki completed his assessment quietly, working from head to feet with hands slow enough not to startle. No fractures, no wounds, some bruising along the left shoulder and the back of the skull, consistent with rough, unintentional contact, bruising that would fade. The kind of damage that tells you the morning was hard, but not the kind that follows you. He's going to need monitoring for several hours, Dr. Mbeki said, but nothing here that can't be managed. Rosa nodded. She was watching the baby's left hand. It had been lying open and still against the blanket since they brought him in. Then the fingers curled. Slowly, incompletely, the searching motion of a newborn that hasn't found anything to hold on to yet, but deliberate, unmistakable, moving toward the edge of the blanket like something in him already knew that holding on was the right idea. Rosa placed her gloved finger against his palm. The hand closed around it. She looked up at the ceiling for a moment before looking back down. He was in there, bruised and cold and exhausted, but in there, reaching for the first solid thing within range, and refusing to let go. That single motion told her more than any number on any monitor could. Then Dr. Mbeki said the thing that had been quietly filling the room for the past 30 minutes without anyone naming it directly. "We need to talk about Nala." Here was the problem, and it was a real one. Leave a gorilla infant separated from its mother too long, and the window for bonding begins to close. Not all at once. Gradually, the way light fades rather than switches off. The infant stops smelling familiar. The pull weakens. By the time reintroduction is attempted, a mother may respond to her own baby the way she would respond to a stranger's, with wariness or confusion, or something worse. Move too fast, and the baby goes back into the same danger they just pulled him out of. There was no clean answer sitting in any protocol. This was the part of the work that experience prepared you for but never fully solved. Daniel came into the care room 40 minutes after the rescue. He stood at the warming surface and looked at the baby for a long moment, the color coming back, the hand curled around Rosa's finger, the chest rising steadily. Then he looked up. "How is Nala?" "Unsettled," Daniel said. "Not aggressive, but she keeps going back to the spot where he was, every few minutes, like she's checking." That mattered. A mother returning to the birth site, over and over, wasn't random behavior. She didn't have the framework to understand what had happened or why, but somewhere below language, below anything she could examine or explain, she knew the space beside her was wrong. She knew something was missing. She was never rejecting him. Daniel said, "That was never what this was." Dr. Mbeki looked at the baby, then at Daniel. "How long do you want to give him?" Daniel looked at the floor. This was the part no amount of training fully covered. The part where all the information was in front of you, and the decision still came down to judgment, and judgment could go wrong in either direction. "A few more hours," he said finally. "Let him get stronger. Let her settle. Then we try a barrier introduction first. Let her see him. Let her hear him. No pressure. No rushing. She needs to hear him before she sees him." As if on cue, the baby opened his mouth. The sound was thin, brief, barely qualified as a cry, but it filled that small room completely. Rosa looked up. Dr. Mbeki stopped writing. Daniel uncrossed his arms. Then the baby made the sound again, slightly stronger, more insistent. The sound of something that had made a decision, quietly and without announcement, that it was not done yet. Daniel picked up the radio. "Start preparing the barrier space," he said. "We're going to try." They moved him just before noon. Not into the enclosure. Not yet. The barrier space was a narrow corridor running along the outer edge of Nala's area. Mesh partition. Solid framing. Close enough for both of them to see each other, hear each other, smell each other. Far enough that if anything went wrong, it could be stopped before it mattered. Rosa settled into a low seat near the mesh, the baby wrapped and warm against her. His eyes were open, not fully tracking yet, not responding to much, but open, present, further along than he had been 2 hours ago. Daniel opened the shift door. Nala came through without hesitation. No coaxing this time. No fruit call. No patient ritual of convincing. She moved through the door the way an animal moves when it already knows where it's going, crossed the space in a few long strides and stopped at the mesh. She hadn't seen the baby in 5 hours. For a moment she simply stood there, hands at her sides, head slightly lowered, looking at the bundle in Rosa's arms with something that was impossible to name precisely, and impossible to misread. The frantic, disoriented energy of the morning was still somewhere in her, but it had compressed, settled, like a current that had finally found a channel. Then the baby made a sound. Nala went completely still. It was the same thin cry from the care room, still effortful, still costing him something. But Rosa had learned what it meant by now. It wasn't despair, it was demand, the sound of a body that had stopped conserving and started asking. Nala's hands came up and gripped the mesh, not pulling, not shaking, just holding. Her eyes locked on the bundle in Rosa's arms. She made that low, private sound again, the one from the corridor that morning, the one with no translation. Daniel watched her hands and did not move. Rosa shifted the baby slightly, angling him toward the partition, slow, deliberate, just making him a little more visible, a little more real. Nala leaned forward. Her face came close to the mesh, close enough that her breath fogged the metal, and she looked at him with an intensity that was uncomfortable to witness, not because it was frightening but because it was so completely unguarded. Nothing strategic, nothing held back, just a mother looking at the thing she had been trying to locate for the past 5 hours. The baby turned his head toward the sound of her breathing, that small movement, that tiny involuntary rotation of a newborn head toward a familiar sound. Nobody in the room said anything. Daniel's jaw tightened. Rosa looked down at the baby for a moment before she could look back up. They held the barrier introduction for 90 minutes. Nala didn't leave the mesh for the first 40. She stood or crouched, always shifting but always returning, always keeping him in her line of sight. She stopped making sounds. She just watched. And the watching itself was different now. Slower, more deliberate. The overwhelming energy of the morning had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, become something that looked, from the outside, like it might eventually become steadiness. Rosa began moving the baby closer to the mesh in small stages, a few inches at a time. Never a single approach, never anything that could feel like pressure. Each time she moved, Nala's grip on the mesh tightened and then slowly relaxed, tightened and relaxed. Her breathing stayed even. When the blanket was nearly touching the partition, Nala lowered her hands from the mesh. She sat back on her heels, looked at the baby with her hands resting open on the floor in front of her, fingers loose, nothing braced or ready. Daniel looked at Dr. Mbeki, one small nod. The full reintroduction happened across the rest of the afternoon. There was no single dramatic moment, no door swinging open, no sudden resolution. It was slower than that, more honest than that, and in its own way more powerful. Nala was allowed into the shared space with the baby still in Rosa's arms. She approached wide, circled, read the room with her whole body the way gorillas do. She came close, pulled back, came close again. Rosa stayed low and still, and let the speed be Nala's to set. The first time Nala touched him, she used the backs of 2 fingers against the edge of the blanket, then pulled her hand back, then tried again. This time her fingers found the baby's back, and held there for 3 full seconds before withdrawing. Not pressing, not gripping, just touching, carefully, with a tentativeness that was nothing like the rough, uncertain contact of the morning. She had arrived somewhere new in the hours between, not through training or instruction, but through whatever internal process animals move through, that has no name and leaves no record. The baby turned toward her warmth. That was the moment. Not a sound, not a gesture, not anything the humans arranged or facilitated. Just a newborn animal turning instinctively toward the largest, warmest presence within reach, toward his mother. Nala went still. Then she lowered herself to the floor beside him. Not on him, not over him, beside him. She drew him against her chest with one careful arm. Imperfect, not the fluid cradling of an experienced mother, but gentle, intentional. She held him there and looked down at him and did not move. The room stayed quiet. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything. There is a kind of silence that falls in moments like this that feels less like absence and more like the room itself holding something carefully. That was the silence in that corridor, and everyone in it let it stay. In the days that followed, Nala made mistakes. That is the honest version of this story, and it is the only version worth telling. She held him awkwardly sometimes, shifted too quickly. There were moments when a keeper had to step in briefly, a gentle redirect, a short separation to let them both reset. First-time gorilla motherhood in a sanctuary is not a transformation that happens in one afternoon. It is a slow process that asks for patience from everyone, including the mother herself. But she kept coming back to him. Every time they were briefly separated for a health check or a weight assessment, she was waiting when he returned. She began to hold him lower, more securely. She began responding to his sounds with real attention, stilling when he cried, adjusting her position, learning by slow trial what each sound meant and what it needed. Daniel said something 2 weeks later, in a recorded debrief, that stayed with the team for a long time. He said that people expect animal motherhood to be automatic, that they expect instinct to arrive complete and fully formed the moment the baby exists. But instinct, he said, is not a switch, it is a direction, and sometimes, especially for a young animal, navigating a difficult birth in an overwhelming moment, that direction needs a little help finding itself. They went in because the direction had gotten lost. Briefly, in the noise and the confusion and the weight of a first morning neither of them had been ready for. They went in to hold the space steady long enough for it to find its way back, and in the end, quietly, without ceremony, that is exactly what it did. Nala pressed her face against the top of her baby's head. He curled his fingers into her chest, and outside the glass the world continued at whatever pace it keeps, while inside that enclosure something small and hard-won simply rested, at last, where it had always been meant to be.